What's up guys, my name is Ace, and today we can finally cover all of the weapon balancing changes that we got with yesterday's Season 1 update in Modern Warfare 2. And with this, I don't just read the patch notes, because the patch notes that Infinity Ward tends to give are extremely vague, and it's kind of pointless to just read them out to you guys. Instead, I went in and tested everything that I could possibly test, and I'm going to be sharing the exact values and changes with you. Without further ado, let's dive right into it and start it off with the Kastov 545. This one got a buff to its aim down sight speed. However, based on my hand testing, this was a pretty much negligible change to our aim down sight speed. Like, as far as I could tell, it's only about 5 milliseconds faster, but in either case, it did get a slight buff there. They also mentioned that they improved the iron sight aim down sight picture, and I just wanted to show you guys the side-by-side before and after here. And if you look really closely at that front sight, you can see there was a very slight adjustment there. Nothing too major though with the 545. After that, let's get into the Kastov 74U, and with this one, our aim down sight speed was actually nerfed. It used to be 210 milliseconds, now they slowed it down to about 240 milliseconds, which is right in line with most of the other assault rifles now. It used to be the one big standout gun, not so much anymore with aim down sight speed. But on top of this, they also increased our hip spread, but only the maximum hip spread while we're moving. So if you're standing still, you won't notice a difference here at all. However, while moving, our hipfire diameter was increased by about 5%. So it's going to be a little bit worse at hip firing, but it wasn't a massive change by any means. After that, let's get into everybody's favorite assault rifle in Modern Warfare 2. This is the M16. We actually got a lot of buffs to this, which is nice to see. The first thing is they mentioned a rate of fire increase, and as far as I can tell with my hand testing, the rate of fire within the burst is still 811 rounds per minute, but they significantly cut down the burst delay from 160 milliseconds down to roughly 110 milliseconds. That is a very noticeable change, and that also impacts our 4-shot time to kill, because we can cut that burst delay down. Instead of 382 milliseconds, it's now 332 milliseconds. This makes the gun quite a bit more forgiving. On top of that, they reduced the hipfire diameter, our maximum hipfire diameter again, by about 10% here. Our aim lock and movement speed was also noticeably improved from 2.38 meters per second up to 2.54 meters per second. And then let's have a look at our recoil change as well. We can see here, the burst doesn't kick up nearly as much as it used to, although there is still some randomness in there. It will kick side to side a little bit. But more importantly, our single burst recoil is very noticeably improved now with the M16. You can see that it's a much tighter burst, and therefore we can actually get those one burst kills far more effectively with the M16. And that's really nice to see. The M16 seems much more viable after this update. However, that's just covering the burst mode on the M16. They also made some specific adjustments to the semi-auto mode with this. The first thing I noticed is it does look like they've added a rate of fire cap that's lower than at 811 rounds per minute, but with hand testing, I can't even be 100% sure that that's the case. I'm just noticing that it does seem to be slowed down, and I am hitting the cap every now and then. So if I had to guess based on my testing, I think they cut this down to about 600 rounds per minute, which is still well beyond most people's trigger fingers. On top of that, they improved the recoil significantly in semi-auto mode. That's a night and day difference, as you can see there. And then they also nerfed our damage when we switch it over to semi-auto mode, which they didn't do pre-patch with this gun. And as you can see here, basically everything got nerfed aside from that upper torso multiplier zone. That part didn't change at all, so if you're hitting the upper torso, you'll be just as effective. However, if you're missing that upper torso, it's going to be a lot less forgiving for you, and it's often going to be taking you an extra bullet to kill when you're in semi-auto mode. Overall, I just recommend keeping this in burst mode from now on, because it did get some really nice improvements to that area. As for the next gun that saw some changes, this is the STB556, and unfortunately with this, within the maximum damage range from 0 to 15 meters, they nerfed our damage across the board, and it's no longer a 3-shot kill to the body. You have to mix a headshot in if you still want to get a 3-shot kill, so that's a very noticeable nerf to this gun up close. But on top of that, this gun was the big outlier when it comes to sprint out time. It used to have an 83 millisecond standard sprint out time and 158 millisecond tactical sprint out time. They've nerfed that a little bit, but this is still a massive standout in the assault rifle category, and it's much more in line with the SMGs now. It used to be faster than all the SMGs. Now it's essentially the same as SMGs, which means it's still amazing for aggression as an assault rifle. It's just not quite as amazing as it used to be. After that, let's get into the FTAC Recon battle rifle, and with this one, they improved our aim down sight speed by about 20 milliseconds based on my testing. They also mentioned they improved the speed and handling with the 5-round magazine, but unfortunately I have no pre-patch data on that, so I can't tell you exactly what changed, but they said they improved the handling there. Additionally, they mentioned they increased flinch caused by bullets with this gun, so I believe this actually causes more flinch when you shoot enemies, based on how they worded it here. Again, unfortunately, no pre-patch data, so I can't show you a before and after there. We just have to sort of take their word for it. But finally, there was a hipfire spread decrease, so a buff to our hipfire. And again, this applies to our maximum hipfire spread while moving, not the minimum hipfire spread. And this was a roughly 7.5% reduction to the diameter of our hipfire spread, which is noticeable. After that, with the SO14, they mentioned they increased hipfire when full auto, which again, I don't have any pre-patch testing done with that, so I can't show you any before or after. And after that, there were a bunch of adjustments to flinch with various guns in this game, and while I thankfully did just make a flinch video, and therefore I have at least some pre-patch testing, I didn't test with literally every gun in the game, so I can't show you a before and after with all of the guns that changed. And additionally, something I pointed out in the patch notes is there's apparently a long distance flinch as well as a close range flinch, and I only tested at one range, so I can only show you before and after within the range that I tested. In either case, the big change here that's very noticeable is to two of the marksman rifles at least. These are the SAB-50 as well as the SPR. Now, pre-patch, I only had the testing done with the SPR, and when we compare it to post-patch, they literally doubled the amount of flinch that you experience with the SPR, which is really nice to see. You now have a much better chance of flinching those players off target. And it turns out the post-patch flinch for the SAB-50 is the same as the post-patch flinch for the SPR. So I think the SAB was actually a bit worse in the flinch department before this patch, because they said it was only a minor increase to the flinch with that gun, and they're both equal now after this patch. But then they also mentioned various flinch adjustments to assault rifles, SMGs, LMGs, and pistols. And at least within the range that I tested at and I'm making this comparison with, there was no noticeable change here whatsoever. That's not to say that they didn't change anything. I'm sure something was adjusted there somewhere. It's just with the testing range that I chose, there is no noticeable change whatsoever to flinch with anything but those marksman rifles as far as I can tell. And finally, let's get into the SMG category here. With the FSS Hurricane, they increased our aim down sight movement speed from 3.06 meters per second up to 3.14 meters per second. That is a noticeable adjustment, so you can strafe a little bit better while aiming down sight. They also increased our headshot damage. As we can see there, up close, the headshot damage is still the same. We're not going to get a 2-shot kill to the head up close or anything. But for every other damage range, there is a slight increase to our headshot damage, and therefore, it's going to help a little bit more to be going for those headshots, mixed in with body shots, of course. Additionally, they increased our far damage range, but this only applies to that 5-shot kill range, as you can see there. It was a 5% improvement to our 5-shot kill range, which is nice, but not really going to affect a ton of situations out there for you. After that, let's move on to the Minibak, and I was very surprised to see a bunch of nerfs to this gun. I never really thought this gun stood out in any way. The first thing they mentioned is they decreased the movement speed. However, our base walking movement speed is identical pre-patch versus post-patch. This did, however, affect our aim down sight movement speed. There was a noticeable nerf there, and there was a pretty much negligible decrease to our sprint movement speed. But on top of that, they increased our aim down sight speed from 260 milliseconds up to roughly 275 milliseconds. This is noticeable. And then they also nerfed our maximum hipfire spread while moving by about 5%. On top of that, the patch notes mentioned a damage range decrease. It turns out this only applies to our maximum damage range. It used to be 13.5 meters, and it's now about 11 meters. The other damage ranges weren't touched at all. And like I said, I was just surprised to see nerfs for the Minibak. I always thought this was kind of an okay SMG, but not really a standout one that deserved any nerfs, personally. But after that, we saw a bunch of buffs to the PDSW, which, again, this surprised me. If anything, I always thought the PDSW was better than the Minibak. Apparently not according to their internal data, though. With this, we see a movement speed increase, but again, our base walking movement speed didn't change at all. However, we did see a very slight improvement to our aim down sight movement speed, and a noticeable improvement to our sprint movement speed as well here. Then after that, our aim down sight speed was improved by a very noticeable margin from 280 milliseconds down to roughly 255 milliseconds. And then they mentioned that there was a hip spread decrease, and I tried standing still with hip spread. I also tried moving with hip spread, and I'm seeing no measurable change here whatsoever. So I'm not entirely sure what they did here, but it seems like your hip fire is going to be pretty much just as effective post-patch compared to pre-patch with this gun. But then they also improved our damage ranges a little bit with the PDSW, and it looks like this was a roughly 7.5% increase to all of our damage ranges, not just that maximum damage range, and this will make the gun a bit more effective across the board. And then they also added a bunch of laser and flashlight attachments to the PDSW that just simply weren't there to begin with. And then finally, for the changes to show off for you guys, we have the VEL 46 or the MP7. And with this, they just mentioned a damage range increase. And this was actually the most noticeable damage range increase. We're looking at a roughly 10% increase across the board to all of our damage ranges. So that's going to make the VEL a little bit more effective in the game. And then finally in the notes, they just mentioned with the Signal 50 sniper rifle, they fixed attributes on the Signal 50 barrels. And at this stage, I've only done fairly basic sniper rifle testing, so I don't really know what they changed when it comes to these barrels. But with that, that's finally going to wrap it up for today's video, covering the actual data and details for the big patch that we got yesterday with Season 1. Overall, if we're just strictly focusing on weapon balancing, I think this was a good step in the right direction, primarily for the M16. I'm glad to see that the M16 is going to be much more viable. Also, I do feel like that STB 556 did deserve a little bit of a nerf, so I think that was a positive change, even though I was really loving using that gun. And then finally, I love the fact that they increased the amount of flinch on the marksman rifles by a very noticeable margin, which is going to make face-to-face fights against them a lot less frustrating at least. Of course, those are just my thoughts though, and I want to hear from you guys in those comments down below. What are you thinking about all of the changes that they made to weapon balance with the Season 1 update? Are you generally happy with these changes, or not so much? If you enjoyed the video, a like rating is always appreciated, and don't forget to subscribe for more if you haven't already. I'll talk to you guys next time.